Blessings, good evening. We have a few questions tonight. The first is, Dear Ajahn, could it be that the mind contains all, but it is not a container? And that the mind has in it or access to both the conditioned and unconditioned. And that with the conditioned things arising, these are said to be from unskillful actions, and the unconditioned arising is with skillful effort and action. Thank you for your guidance. Could it be that the mind contains all, but it's not a container? Sometimes we do talk about the mind as being like a container. It's more of a metaphor or just a description because it kind of helps us to understand it better. You look back at your mind or become more aware, directing awareness back to the mind itself. And one way of looking at it, you can say, well, mental states arise within the mind. We say that. It's not really within, you could say just accompany the mind. They arise from moment to moment with moments of consciousness, sometimes wholesome, sometimes unwholesome. But sometimes we can say container, it's just a description. Really the mind is just that quality that knows. It's just the natural quality of knowing. To know, to be aware. But through the presence of ignorance, the Buddhist word is avijja, because avijja is present, not knowing is present, the mind knows wrongly. And that's where all the trouble starts, and that's why the Buddha said the origin of all our suffering and problems begins with avijja, ignorance. As long as ignorance is conditioning the mind, then the mind knows wrongly, or with wrong view, wrong understanding, delusion, and that leads on to suffering. Whereas cultivating the path, like you said, cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path, skillful effort, skillful action, all the 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. So beginning with right effort, right understanding or right view, through to right samadhi. These are all considered wholesome karma, skillful qualities that act or result in the removal of avijja ultimately, which is why the Buddha taught this. So this is the way of practice that will lead to the removal of the causes of suffering and the complete ending of suffering. Not just the reduction of suffering, but the complete ending of suffering without remainder. So the complete removal of avijja without remainder. So bringing the mind to be completely unconditioned, the mind of an arahant. So knowing, you might say knowing correctly. Before the person was an arahant, they knew wrongly or incorrectly. But having cultivated the Noble Eightfold Path, they reach a point where they know correctly. So the mind is unconditioned, free from or liberated from the causes of suffering. And the unconditioned is not really something you would keep in a vessel. Vessel indicates kind of limits, doesn't it? A vessel, a container has edges or boundaries, whereas the unconditioned is kind of without boundaries, without limits and edges. Sometimes we call it the pure mind. Sometimes they call it the Dhammadhatu, the mind with the Dhamma of the Dhamma element, the truth, as an element, meaning not a person or a being, element, just a natural element, the pure, unconditioned mind. In other words, for it, we have the deathless, the highest happiness. So the unconditioned is the highest happiness, but that's not a happiness that is sort of contained. It's more the absence of suffering, therefore happiness. One way we talk about reaching this, as you cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path, you're sort of clearing away greed, anger and delusion until there's none of that left. So what's left is the unconditioned, because greed, anger and delusion are what we call mental defilements rooted in avijja, ignorance, condition the mind, cause more suffering, more delusion, more attachment. The whole process by which suffering arises is reinforced over and over again by the presence of greed, anger and delusion, rooted in ignorance. So until that is known and seen, until that realization, then without trying very hard, we keep creating more suffering, keep conditioning the mind, or knowing wrongly. And when we know wrongly, we have a sense of self. This is me, this is who I am. We attach to things, the body, the mind, as self. And that kind of promotes the whole problem that's rooted in ignorance. So that's the way I prefer to look at it. I mean, people have different ways of describing it, but it's not so much you're accessing something. I guess you could describe it that way, but my way of looking at it is more just clearing away what's blocking the unconditioned, clearing away the conditions of the mind and the attachment, the identification with the conditions of mind, until there's nothing more to clear, and that's the unconditioned. So the unconditioned is there all the time, you might say. You might say it's the Dhamma, the truth, is constantly there, whether a Buddha arises in the world or not, whether people practice the Dhamma or not, it's always there, but it's covered over. We don't recognize it, we don't know it. But through the practice, cultivating this Noble Eightfold Path in all its aspects, penetrating the Four Noble Truths, suffering, its cause, abandoning the cause, the cessation of suffering, cultivating the path leading to the cessation of suffering. By developing insight and practicing according to the Four Noble Truths, we remove all the conditioning forces affecting this mind so that it does see things or know things clearly. And we call that Nibbana, for want of a better word. Dear Ajahn, I recently learned the hand movement meditation technique of Lumpur Tien, Citta Supho, and find it calms me and increases my awareness both while sitting in meditation and while going about my daily work. Was Lumpur Tien considered to be an arahant by the time he died? I think the technique he taught fits my temperament well, but I don't want to spend time developing it if it isn't creating the causes for the final end of suffering. Thank you for your guidance. Well, I never knew Luang Por Thien personally when he was alive. I met one or two of his students, and when he was alive, he was quite famous, at least in a modest way, in Thailand as a meditation master. I've never heard anyone refer to him as an arahant, but maybe some people did. I don't know. But like many teachers, he had his own sort of style, his own technique. As you said, this way of developing awareness, mindfulness by moving the arms in certain ways. I mean, I've never studied it, so I can't really describe it properly, but using the hand, focusing on that. And a lot of people find that helpful in the beginning of their meditation when their mind is all over the place, confused, thinking a lot, restless, anxious. And just to sit there, as people say, just to sit and watch your breath is too difficult. Some people find the breath is too subtle, and some other meditation objects, such as recollecting the Buddha, they just can't do it. So there's I'd say a small percentage of people find this moving the arm in certain ways as following the steps that Luang Por Thien taught, find it helpful, as he must have. He must have found it helpful for him, for developing mindfulness, otherwise he wouldn't have taught it. But it's not what you call a mainstream technique. It's a particular technique that he developed and found helpful. And I would say more important is how is it practiced in conjunction with other aspects of the Buddhist path. As I just mentioned in the previous question or answer, the Buddhist path is what we call the Noble Eightfold Path, with 8 main factors which break into sub-factors and components as well, but beginning with right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. This is what we call the Noble Eightfold Path, for helping one purify the mind of greed, anger and delusion to penetrate the Four Noble Truths. So if you do take up a technique that's not particularly mentioned in the Buddhist suttas, which this isn't, but I'm not saying it's not useful for anyone, but if you do take it up, make sure the other aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path, you're paying attention to them, listening to them, learning and practicing them. Because any technique that's kind of a bit, you might say, on the borderline, the fringe, out of the norm, well, that's the danger, is that you may stray away from the Noble Eightfold Path, perhaps. I'm not saying you are or you will, but that's something to bear in mind. But as I said, many teachers have, over the course of their practice, sometimes at different times, they've developed sometimes fairly unique reflections, meditation techniques, personal rules of practice that have helped them get through problems in their meditation. You know, there's the textbooks. I mean, the textbooks themselves are divided into the suttas, by and large the word of the Buddha, and then the commentaries which have come after. And then there's modern teachers again who may have their own insights, but many of these teachers, just as even in the time of the Buddha, may have emphasized one aspect of the practice that worked for them. So, you know, people or teachers became enlightened chopping wood, being focused on the action of their hand, chopping wood, reflecting on impermanence, suffering, not self, as they chop wood, observing the wood disappear. The more you chop it, the wood changes, shape changes. Contemplating that, they got enlightened. Some monks walk a lot and got enlightened doing walking meditation. Some monks sit a lot. So posture can vary for the way, the emphasis on sitting or walking can vary between teachers. Some teachers get enlightened with a lot of faith, some with a lot more contemplation. There are variations between different meditators, different characters, both in the time of the Buddha and in the modern age. So there is room for variation, and sometimes people have their techniques. But as I said, everything should be practiced in conjunction with the Noble Eightfold Path and that kind of understanding that you get from that, for it to be Buddhism and for it to lead to the result, the desired result, the end of suffering, Nibbana. Ajahn, what is Samvega and what is its role in Buddhism? Samvega sometimes is translated as urgency in the practice. Sometimes it's translated as sobering up from intoxication. Sometimes even as waking up, kind of waking up to the truth. But when it's translated as a sense of urgency, that's an urgency that comes from seeing the truth. So it's a wholesome quality. That quality where the mind sees some aspect of the suffering of life, the impermanence of life perhaps, and that leads on to a sense of urgency to want to practice, to get out of suffering. Maybe realizing that life is impermanent, we're not here forever, so then we must hurry up and practice. Seeing the suffering of other people through their actions, suffering, and how people can suffer through their life, and wanting to get beyond that, seeing one's own suffering. So, as I said, one aspect is the sobering up from a state of intoxication, because when we're born into the world and we're not that wise yet, we tend to get intoxicated with everything. Not just alcohol and drugs. Intoxication here means with our senses, seeking pleasure, enjoying things, absorbing into things, indulging in things, and often just letting time drift by without being fully aware of the dangers of not practicing, not cultivating wisdom, understanding. The fragility of life, who knows what lies ahead? We could fall ill, we could have an accident, we could die young, we don't know. Waking up to some of that through maybe hearing the Dhamma is one way that you develop Samvega, probably one of the most common ways. You hear Dhamma and you reflect on it. It makes you want to practice, makes you want to look for the way out of suffering. But of course, in a deeper sense, it comes from your own reflection inside your heart. And sometimes for some practitioners, it seems to just pop up or come up quite naturally. But I would say it's not just coming up out of the blue, it's a result of maybe previous meditation, reflection they've done, and then when the conditions are right, it comes up sometimes very strongly. So it's a wholesome quality. You might say it's rooted in wisdom. It's an aspect of panya, wisdom, seeing the way things are and then looking for a way out and wanting to practice. Sometimes it leads people to want to ordain. Men and women get Samvega and they say, I'm off to the monastery. I've enough of the household life, jobs, socializing, entertainments, whatever it is that they find not so meaningful, more trivial, less meaningful, they've had enough of that. They want to do something more purposeful with their life. So go to ordain maybe. If it doesn't lead to ordination, it might lead to wanting to at least learn the Dhamma more, meditate, do more good, use your time more well, in a better way. As I said, it's sometimes mistakenly translated as depression or a sadness with the world. But those imply a sort of negative, unwholesome state of mind, like depression is a form of suffering, negativity, sadness. Kind of when you wake up to some of the truths, that can actually happen. You can become sad at first as you develop insight into impermanence. You realize nothing lasts, you won't last, other people won't last, the various pleasures and successes and worldly types of happiness won't last. It can be a little bit saddening at first, but if that's of the negative, unwholesome kind, then it's not considered an aspect of wisdom. It's just depression, sadness, annoyance even. We get annoyed because we realize we're not going to have all the pleasures we want forever. But Samvega is a sobering up, a waking up to the truth. So it's a sadness coming with seeing the way things are, and it leads to a turning away. Part of this sense of urgency wanting to practice is turning away from the world, turning away from intoxication, waking up, coming out of a previous state of complacency or not realizing one's full situation. Suddenly one is now realizing. So of course it can come during meditation as well. One sort of realizes how attachments and desires, so many of them are just frivolous, fruitless, a source of suffering, pointless. Sometimes it can be in a more normal situation, but just something clicks. So like for me personally, when I was probably the first time I understood the word, at least on one level, was when I sitting in a bar with friends when I was a layman, a student, and going about a normal night's entertainment, people drinking and talking and enjoying themselves, but for some reason my mind separated off from the whole scene, and I just kind of felt like I was just floating there, couldn't even feel my body. I was just floating there, asking myself, what am I doing here? I'm wasting my time. Everyone here, they're going to get old, they're going to die. It sounds kind of crazy, but sometimes it can be like that. You have a very powerful sense of separation or some kind of letting go or just a new way of looking at things in a situation that at first you wouldn't think that would happen, but sometimes it can happen in those situations. Other people I know, they go to work and they have that, that going into work, they say, what are we all doing here? Where's this all leading to? What's the point? But it's because it's coming from wisdom, doesn't lead to a sense of paralysis or depression or not being able to do anything. It leads one to sense, one gets a better perspective on things and realise what is important in life and what's maybe not so important. So it's a realisation. It may be just a brief one, but sometimes it can be very profound, and that's why sometimes it leads people to go off and become a monk or a nun maybe. Death is a very common prompter of Samvega. So like Ajahn Chah said he was already a monk when his father died, but his father told him on his deathbed, his father told his son, Ajahn Chah, don't disrobe, practice. You get Samvega when a close relative or someone you know, maybe someone you respect or someone important in your life dies, then you get that clear sense of life is impermanent, and then maybe that prompts you to want to practice. So many things can stimulate this. It's a wholesome quality. It's that waking up to the truth and the urgency and the sense I've got to practice now. Venerable Sir, I am a Buddhist. Venerable Sir, what is the teaching on paticca samuppada, dependent origination? Why did the Buddha not use the complete description method for the 5 aggregates in the paticca samuppada, that is, form, feeling, perception, fabrications and consciousness? Why did he use the term name and form, nama rupa, instead? That's a good question, quite a deep one. So the teaching on paticca samuppada, as you've said, dependent origination. They call this the heart of the Buddhist teaching. So paticca, if I remember right, means independence on or related to, or samupapada, the Pali, is arising. So things arise. It's the teaching that all conditions arise in dependence on causes and conditions, other causes and conditions. And this is the Buddha explained in particular in relation to how suffering arises. One, how we have come to be born, which is a good question to answer, and in particular how suffering arises. But then also how suffering ceases, how birth ceases. When birth ceases, suffering ceases. They go hand in hand. But the Buddha loved to analyze and explain things out and break things down. So the teaching on dependent origination, how we come to suffer as human beings, broke into 12 stages or 12 factors, main factors. And so it begins with avijja, as I was talking about earlier, the first. Because there is avijja, there are mental formations. We think, we speak, we do because of avijja. When there's no avijja present, there's no longer a need to think, speak, do. We don't make karma anymore. Karmic formations, when you reduce them right down, they come from ignorance. And ignorance is often described as ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. So because we don't fully understand the Four Noble Truths, we think, thinking as in volitional thought, intentional thought, we make choices, we want to do things, and then we also speak and we do. Dependent on that, consciousness arises. And consciousness here can mean the very first moment of consciousness in your life. Why are we born? Because of the previous existence of avijja, ignorance. So you would say from a previous existence, a previous life. Although you might not be able to remember your past life, if you study avijja, paccaya, sankhara, avijja is a cause for karmic formations, mental formations to arise. Sankhara, paccaya, vijnana. In this life you can start studying this, and maybe that gives you an insight into past lives, future lives. And these 12 stages the Buddha described, you go through nama rupa, as we talked earlier, is physicality, mentality, or name and form, body and mind. With consciousness as a cause, Nama-rupa arises. Nama-rupa is, of course, salayatana. Salayatana means the 6 sense bases. So a human being has 5 physical sense bases, and the mind is the 6th. With 6 sense bases there, you can have sense contact. So you've got eyes, so you can see. Every moment of seeing is what we call sense contact, eye contact. With eye contact, you get feeling, or ear contact, or nose contact, depending which sense. You always get feeling arising. So pleasant, unpleasant, or painful, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant, neutral. Dependent on feeling, craving arises. So the immediate cause for craving arising is always feeling, but it's not alone. These aren't sort of singular causes. It's simply put in a series because it's describing the prominent cause stage by stage, but all the previous stages also play a part. So like when there's avijja and there's sense contact, so when there's not knowing, lack of mindfulness, lack of wisdom, and there's sense contact and feeling arises, it will prompt craving to arise, which is the next stage in the paticca samuppada. Dependent on feeling, craving arises. Dependent on craving, clinging arises. Clinging, tightening of craving. Or as Ajahn Buddhadasa used to say, craving is like the dog barking at you. Clinging is like the dog biting. It's tighter, it's more painful, it's more serious. Dependent on clinging, becoming arises, bhava. Dependent on becoming, birth, there's birth. And so then you get into, the next life. Where does this next life come from? If it's true, as the Buddhists describe, why do we get born again? It's because of becoming based on clinging, based on craving. So starting with avijja, you go right through to birth. And birth is naturally followed by aging, sickness and death, and accompanied by all kinds of suffering. Probably if you're listening to this talk, you've already appreciated in your life you have some different kinds of suffering, disappointments, frustrations, despairs, physical pain, mental pain, all kinds of suffering arises based on being born. If you weren't born, you wouldn't have to suffer. And where does ignorance, the first stage in this whole 12-step process by describing how suffering arises, where does ignorance come from? Well, it's a cycle, isn't it? That's why you get all these drawings and diagrams and artworks in the shape of a circle. With suffering, when suffering is met with a mind that doesn't fully understand the Four Noble Truths, it conditions more ignorance. So you get frustrated by something, or you have some pain, you get annoyed, you get upset, you spin out more suffering. So you go back to avijja. With ignorance, more karma. So you stub your toe, you get angry, you shout and swear and wave your fist, and you start getting angry, and you make more karma. Your consciousness is now conditioned by anger. Name and form means body and mind are affected by that moment of anger, aren't they? You tense up and you have a negative train of thought. Salayatana may be affected, what you see and what's going on, and so on. This is a circle reinforcing itself. As long as we don't practice the Dhamma, listen to the good Dhamma, train ourselves in the Noble Eightfold Path, the cycle or the circle of paticca samuppada keeps spinning and keeps getting deeper and reinforcing itself. So we suffer over and over again, and the Buddha would say life after life. And he said we live for endless lives. But the good news is he also taught the cessation of this whole process, and that's what we are also learning and practicing. It's a very profound thing, the Paticcasamuppada, but it can be put into reverse, so to speak. So with the cessation of becoming and clinging and craving, the whole thing can come back to ignorance, and with the cessation of ignorance, the whole process can come to grind to a halt or come to a stop. And that's Nibbana, where ignorance has been abandoned. So without ignorance present, one no longer makes karma. Karmic formations don't arise. If you're not making karmic formations, there's no cause for consciousness to arise, no more birth. So we call Nibbana the deathless. So there's the Paticcasamuppada in the forward and reverse cycle. The ancient teaching on reverse cycle. Nowadays we all think about air conditioning units. So that's the good news, that the Buddha taught the reverse cycle of the Paticcasamuppada for the ending of suffering, or the cessation of suffering. So cessation or extinguishing is seen as a good word in Buddhism. It's a good thing. And all our practice is to penetrate this with clear knowledge and vision and wisdom, and to develop enough strength of mind, strength of effort, mindfulness, insight, sila, samadhi, panya, Noble Eightfold Path, to affect this process of cessation, to stop clinging, to stop craving and desiring, to see that they lead to suffering, so to give them up and gradually purify the mind right back to avijja. If avijja is gone, then there's no more suffering to be had, no more birth. And that's what the Buddha said. It is enlightenment, no more birth for me. Anyway, that's a sort of synopsis of the Paticcasamuppada. It is probably the most profound teaching, and you probably have heard, the occasion when the Buddha described a bit of this, and Venerable Ananda, poor old Ananda, was listening and said, yeah, now I've got it. I understand this. Yeah, dependent origination. Yeah, it's not that hard to understand. Yeah, I've got it. And the Buddha said, no, don't say that. This is a very profound, deep teaching. Don't just say you've got it just like that. Don't be casual. So anyway, so we can learn the words, and that's good, but to practice it is another thing. And that's also what Ajahn Chah used to say. Paticcasamuppada is a very good thing to study it, the suttas, even the Abhidhamma, learn it, understand it intellectually, get the concepts, and that is a very good way to sort of understand much of what the Buddha was talking about. But that's not the same as actually knowing it with your heart and purifying your heart from avijja. That takes a lot of practice. So just bear that in mind. And that second part of that question was, why did the Buddha use the terminology nama rupa as opposed to the 5 aggregates? Well, kind of, it means the same thing. 5 aggregates are often used as a particular way of reflecting or contemplating experience. The Buddha described a human being like he would do all the time, is break things down, analyze things down. So a human being in so many areas of the Buddha's teachings is described as a combination of these 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perceptions, mental formations, sense consciousness. And for developing insight into impermanence, suffering, not self, that's a really useful grouping of experiences, and one can further divide them up. So form can be divided into the 4 main elements, and then even other aspects of form. Feeling is the different kinds of feeling: pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. Perceptions, based on sense consciousness and so on. One can keep analysing, breaking apart the five khandhas, and at the same time one is reducing one's attachment to the idea of self, a solid, lasting self that sort of exists all the time and goes from life to life, if that's your belief. It's helping to counter that and break that down, or challenge it, you might say. Nama Rupa is the same, or at least that's still dividing a human being into name, form, mind and body, and Nama can be broken up or analysed down into perceptions, feelings, mental formations as well, and form, Rupa, into the four main elements, earth, air, fire and water. But in terms of Paticcasamuppada, perhaps it was enough just to say Nama Rupa. Perhaps it's just simpler, because there you're focusing more on the conditioned arising of suffering. So you've got the 12 stages, whereas, as I said, the five khandhas are often, what you take up for investigation, what sometimes we call vipassana, developing insight into impermanent suffering, not self, the universal characteristics. So often talked about in terms of contemplation, reflection, seeing the five khandhas as impermanent. Are they permanent? Are they not? Are they self? Are they not? Nama Rupa is more, in this case, a link in a chain. So perhaps it's just easier to say Nama Rupa than go into the five khandhas. You might say it's not the time to go into the five khandhas yet. The Buddha is just setting out the kind of brief description for later. But many of the Buddha's teachings are like this. At one moment he's speaking very generally. At another time he may go right into the detail. Just depends on what he was describing, what aspect of the Dhamma he was picking up on. So I'm not sure that it really matters. I'm also not, I'm not the Buddha, so I can't give you a full answer. I can't speak on behalf of the Buddha. But it seems like that to me. It's just a briefer description of mind and body, and in relation to the arising of suffering, these 12 stages of the Paticcasamuppada. As the Buddha said, this is a very profound subject and we could talk about it all night. There's a lot to discuss, a lot more than we've said here, but maybe we'll just say this much for now and can always talk about it at a later date.